name is Ken Kerner, also known as the Sea Squirrel, and tonight I'm going to be talking to you about fire, or fire from Flint and Steel. So how many times have you actually sat around a campfire with your friends? You know, it's a nice summer evening and you're watching the flames and having great conversation, and maybe you enjoyed a really good day out in the fun and sun, and you stop and think about it. What is it about fire that just feels so appealing to us? That coming home and having the smell of wood smoke, cooking s'mores over a campfire. When I sit around the campfire, I often think about what was it like for our ancestors, not our recent ancestors, but our ancient ancestors, and the fact that we take fire for granted, and for them, it was a struggle. So I want you to stop, I want you to look around the room for a second. I want you to think about what in the room that you're in right now needed fire to produce. There's so many things in our life that needs fire to be produced. Even going so far as a rocket, correct? That's right, rocket engines. They're basically just another means of fire. So we're going to talk today about some of the basic facts that relate to fire and how fire has contributed to our civilization. And then we're going to talk about the process by which you can actually start fire using flint and steel. So, as we talk about facts about fire, we're going to review some of the basics with that. We're going to talk about the actual tools that you need to go about the process of starting fire, not using modern conveniences. And then we're going to go over the exact process of using flint and steel to start a fire. And our objective today is to learn these basic facts and the knowledge for how to produce fire using flint and steel. So, in review, we have to go back and look at what should be common knowledge for most people, and that is the fire pyramid. What 3 things do you need to actually have fire? So, can anyone name one item that we need to start fire? How about you? Correct. Oxygen. Oxygen is one of the first things we need to start a fire. In addition to that, we're going to need a fuel source, and we're also going to need a source of heat. And when you combine all these together, you're going to end up with what's known as the fire pyramid. Take any one of these objects out, you don't have fire. And again, they have to be combined in the right combinations as well, and actually to generate fire. So now that we know how to actually create fire by adding oxygen, fuel, and heat together in the right consistency, we have to think about what are our uses for fire. So who can actually name a use for fire? Everyday use for fire. The most common one is cooking, right? So we use fire for cooking pretty much all the time. Whether it's boiling water, grilling something, cooking on the stove, we're using essentially fire to do that. Now I know we have electric stoves and stuff like that, but we're using cooking. The other thing, it's winter. We got to heat our houses, right? So we use fire for warmth. When we think back even further in time, and we think about ancient times, and maybe you go back far enough, and you're going to actually start to say, well, wait a second, what about fire for, oops, I got a little ahead of myself there. What about fire for smelting? That's right. The Bronze Age starts with fire. The ability to actually create fire on a consistent basis leads to the Bronze Age. And that ability to create weapons, defend our community, etc. And I'm trying to picture how this actually came about. You know, you're cooking a fire or making a fire in the same spot over and over again over the particular type of earth that you need, and eventually you're like, hey, there's something malleable down here, and if I hammer on it, I can actually shape it into something. I can use it or a weapon or something like that. Use it to scrape hides, something like that. But this is an example of Bronze weapons, not Bronze Age weapons. These are actually modern creations, but this is equivalent of a Bronze Age weapon that was actually made through the smelting process. But even something as recently as our most recent space launch, we're using fire. There's an ignition source, and there's fire coming out of that rocket. That's the combustion of gases generating pressure that allows a rocket engine to go. But fundamentally, it's a chemical reaction creating fire. And that fire is an essential part of what we're doing. So we've talked about these basic elements that need to go into actually generating fire, and oxygen, fuel, heat source, and we've talked about some of the uses for fire. I mean, you could think of a myriad, a whole bunch of different uses. But let's think about the history of actually making fire. How did our ancient ancestors actually make fire in history. And so we go back and we look at the archaeological record. And when you look at the early archaeological record, what you're going to see is that up until a certain point, there is no record of any routine use of fire going back hundreds of thousands of years. So we know, looking at the ancient record, that mankind was around for hundreds of thousands of years, or ancient ancestors around, but they didn't have the ability to actually make fire on a regular basis. And then, as they examine the archaeological record, one of the first things they look for in communities to start dating communities is they're going to look for fire pits. You know, back then people just threw junk into the fire. And we used to do that too until we realized that's probably not an ecologically sound thing to do, so we don't do that anymore. We actually pack our garbage out. But when you start looking at the fire pits, what do you find in it? You find pieces of broken clay pots, for example. And I know, watching some of the shows on TV about archaeology, they actually date locations based on these clay pots, because certain clays and certain designs are related to certain time periods. You know, ancient Roman time in Great Britain. And if you stop thinking about that ability to actually make a clay-fired pot, allows you to store grain, keep the rodents out of it, keep it pure. That allows you to create trade networks, because you can now take the grain stored in pots and trade it with somebody else for something of value. And that helps build up that modern civilization as well. So once we get to the point where we actually are generating fire on a regular basis, what we're going to see is that the early people were using basically this technique for generating fire. And there are still societies to this day that actually this is how they generate fire. It's basically taking a piece of hardwood, known as the drill, and you have it in a piece of softwood, and you might put a little bit of charcoal down in the bottom of that. And you can see there's two people working at this, because this takes a lot of effort to do. And as you generate that drill back and forth, you generate enough heat to generate a spark, and eventually you can create flame. And so this is the way that, you know, our ancient ancestors probably created fire. And if you actually were able to create fire, because of the amount of work involved in maintaining the fire, or you maybe acquired fire because there was a lightning strike nearby and you brought it back to your community and you're maintaining that fire, you may have had people whose specific job, their sole job, was keeping the fire burning. Keep the home fires burning, so to speak. And with that concept, there may be some religious overtones to it. Maybe the idea that we have in our society, where in our religious traditions we have a fire burning in our sanctuary or tabernacle on a regular basis. Maybe this goes all the way back to this idea that we had to keep the fire burning, so we had a common source of fire for our community at all times, and keeping the oil in the lamp so the fire is burning on a regular basis. You know, there may be some tie-ins to our ancient ancestors with that. So as we look more recently at the idea of producing fire, something that goes back hundreds of years, maybe thousands of years, the idea of having a tinderbox. Now the tinderbox is equivalent of your pocket lighter, right? It's just a way of creating fire. And I can imagine this comes about because somebody was sitting by a campfire trying to make flint arrowheads, and sparks commenced, and they're like, hey, I can turn that into fire, right? And so we look at this tinderbox, and what do we see in this particular tinderbox? We see a striker and a piece of flint in there, and you're going to actually see some char cloth, and we're going to go over that in just a little bit, discuss what char cloth is about. There's some flax in there. That flax actually takes the spark on the char cloth, turns it into flame, or helps it turn into flame. You got some dry tinder and some other bits in there that are going to actually get the fire going. But I also want to point out something about this box. If you look, it looks like that box has been thrown into the fire from time to time. There's a reason for that. We're going to explain that in a little bit. I'll keep in a little bit of suspense. All right? So, around 1805, the first match was invented. There was some other experimentations that kind of had the same concept. And it took a couple decades before the match really caught on and became a regularly used item. And then also we had the invention of a lighter around 1823. Again, it took a little while for the modern Zippo that we saw from World War II era to come about. There were other versions of this that actually existed before World War II, similar versions of World War I as well. But when you break down a simple lighter, what have you got? You've got a striker, a flint, and a fuel source. It all comes back to one basic element. Can anyone name what that one basic element is that we need every time to start a fire? A spark. That's it, a spark. Now, yes, you can actually start fire using lenses and that sort of thing as well. So there's another way to start fire as well, or start a spark as well, and you probably don't think about it until you actually stop and think about it. It's kind of one of those smack your head and go, oh yeah, a spark plug. Every internal combustion engine uses a spark plug of some sort. And Bosch actually generated the first, or designed the first spark plug around 1902. And that is the component of the modern internal combustion engine. So we've talked about various ways of starting a fire, and we've looked at this tinderbox. Now let's look at the exact tools that you need to actually start a fire. And let's review those tools. All right? So the first thing you need is what I call char cloth, and this is actually commonly referred to. And so here's another example of a tinderbox. When you look at this tinderbox, what you're going to see is there's a striker in here, and you've got a piece of flint as well. And if you kind of pick up over here on this side of the box, there is this charcoaly cloth-looking stuff, and that is char cloth. And the whole reason for char cloth is it holds the spark, and you're going to see this in real life in just a little bit. Now, I'm not going to start a fire right here. I've got a video. I'll show you. So what we do is we take some cotton cloth and we cut it into little rectangles here. At least I cut them in rectangles because my tinderbox is an old Altoids can. And we cut all these little pieces of paper, these little pieces of cloth, and you really want to use cotton. You don't want anything that's synthetic. Synthetics are just going to melt, right? So you use linen, but basically something that's of cotton nature. And you're going to pile it up inside your box. Once it's all nice piled up in there, nice and neat, you're going to seal that box and throw it in the fire. Now, yeah, you have to have fire to actually generate char cloth, so it's kind of which came first, chicken or the egg, but yeah, you got to have a little bit of flame to actually get this process going. But let's look at this for a second, right? Why doesn't my cloth burn up? I've got heat. I've got a fuel source. What's going on inside that box that there's no combustion occurring? There's no oxygen in there. It can't burn because there's no oxygen. It actually creates a perfect material that actually is very ready to accept that spark and help you actually generate fire. So once you've created char cloth, you're going to need something else, and that's going to be your tinder. Now the tinder, I use these shavings to create my, as I call it, the bird's nest, but you need something that's going to actually take that spark and turn it into flame. And you can use virtually anything that is very fine shavings. I recommend soft woods that are very carefully shaved. You can actually use very, very finely shredded pieces of paper, flax. There's a lot of different things that you can use to actually create the conditions to take the spark from your char cloth and your flint and steel, add it to your tinder and create flame. But then you also need something that's going to create the spark itself. So here we have examples of my flint and steel. So this is my flint and steel right here, and that's something I acquired long ago. This is my more modern survival tool that actually will generate a really phenomenal spark when I want it to. So how do we put all this together, right? So to put all this together and actually use it to create fire, you're going to have to take your tinder, and this is the process of actually using all that to produce fire. So you take your bird's nest, you put the char cloth down inside it, and make sure you've got other fuel sources available, because once this actually catches, it's going to burn. It's going to burn really well. And so you want to make sure you've got another little teepee of a bunch of different sizes of wood that are dry and ready to actually receive the fire once you've actually got this started. Then what you're going to do is you're going to take your flint and steel and you're going to strike it to generate a spark, and it's going to land on the char cloth. You may be able to appreciate that there's edges of this burning with a nice little spark right here. And once you have that spark, you're going to pick this whole thing up in your hands and you're going to blow on it. You're going to blow pretty hard. And what it's going to do is actually burst into flames. If you blow on it hard enough, it's going to burst into flames. Don't inhale. You don't inhale all the smoke. You'll be coughing a little bit, then you can't actually blow to get it started. So once that bursts into flames, you're going to tuck it into your teepee of wood that you've already created, and that is going to actually get your fire going. Once this fire is produced, you're going to have to actually continue to add wood to it and keep adding fuel until it has really been nurtured, until it's got a good burning going. And then you're going to build a fire based on what your needs are. Is it a fire for ambiance? Is it a fire for cooking? Are you trying to build a bonfire? You can have a big celebration, lots of people gathered around. What I do recommend is that if you're going to go out and build a campfire, don't build a campfire for ambiance just because you want to build a campfire for ambiance. From time to time, yes, it's good, but there are environmental impacts and risks of fire getting out of control and that sort of stuff. So I don't strongly encourage people to build a fire for ambiance when they're going out camping, just on occasion from time to time. So let's put all these components together and let's see the actual process of building a fire using all these tools.
We're going to talk about how to actually start a fire using flint and steel. This is my bundle of tinder, or my bird's nest as I call it. I have my tinderbox over here. Within that I have some char cloth. I'm going to pull out a little bit of char cloth and tuck that down inside the bird's nest. And then maybe down a little extra piece in there. So I'm really want to make sure this starts in the first go round. What is that? Now I have my traditional flint and steel right here, but I can generate a spark with this, but it's much more reliable to actually use my survival tool. This one will really generate a good spark. So what you have is tinder with char cloth and something to generate a spark with. And as you can see, my char cloth has really gotten a good spark going right there. So now I'm going to give it a good blow. And it starts up just like that. I'm going to cheat a little bit and use my gas grill to add the extra fuel to the fire. And that is how you use flint and steel to start a fire. Thank you.
It's really about that easy. It takes a little bit of practice. Now, if you're going to use the flint and steel down, like the true flint and steel, you actually have to be right down into the bird's nest with that to get the spark to actually take. So, in summary, we've learned basic fire facts and the knowledge for how to produce a fire using flint and steel. Our facts about fire: you got to have a fuel source, heat, and oxygen to put it all together. There are certain tools that you need to actually create fire. Tools to create a spark, tools to actually encourage that spark, and tools to actually turn that spark into a flame. And then we talked about the actual process of using flint and steel to get the whole fire going and being able to generate fire without using modern tools. And that's the thing. We tend to take for granted the fact that when you turn on a gas stove, it just starts. When you turn on the ignition of your car, it just starts, hopefully, most of the time. When you want to have a barbecue, you can take a lighter and go out and light your grill, or light your charcoal, as it were, on your grill. Depends on which tradition you prefer to choose. And because we take all this for granted, we've kind of lost track of the idea that being able to create fire was actually a huge challenge for people just a few hundred years ago. We've taken that for granted. And in certain societies, I can imagine that it was the person who knew how to generate fire on a regular basis with ease. They held a certain higher status within the community. And that ability to maintain a higher status, that ability to move my society forward, all starts with something very simple. That ability to just generate a simple spark. So now everybody here that's listened understands that process of actually being able to create a fire using flint and steel. I invite any questions, and I remind everyone, please, when you go out and try these newfound skills, don't just do it willy-nilly. Have a controlled environment. Practice safety. You saw that I wore my safety goggles, actually, so I didn't singe my eyebrows when that thing burst into flames, and no, it wasn't impregnated with any additional fuel source. That's just the way it works. It starts up nice and readily. So again, I invite any questions. I thank you for your time. If you have questions, leave them at the bottom. Thank you very much.